Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel, and today I'm going to be doing a book review of this book, Sick and Dirty: Hollywood's Gay Golden Age and the Making of Modern Queerness by Michael Koresky. And so we're gonna do that today. So I apologize for the slight delay in my weekly video. I usually try to film and edit my videos on like a Saturday. Unfortunately this week, my Saturday, sometimes I just have other priorities, so I didn't get to it, so we're a day late on this one, but that's okay. I'm also not going to be doing a midweek movies video this week, partly because I don't really have any ideas for it. I've been watching movies, but I just don't really have a whole lot to say about any of the movies that I've watched. And also partly because this video is going to be kind of both the book video and the movie video combined in one, since I'm going to be talking about a book about movies, and I'm going to be discussing some movies. So yeah, this is the video this week. But yeah, next week maybe we'll see what I can come up with. If I can come up with another midweek movies idea, we'll see. But yeah, just, you know, a reminder that this is a hobby for me, not a job. So sometimes you know, the bug doesn't bite me, and I just don't have any inspiration or ideas for things. So anyway, regardless, yes, we're going to be talking about this book today. To preface this, I think this book, it's really important to understand that this book is that Koresky is not trying to position this book as being sort of on its own or in a vacuum. This book is absolutely in conversation with the you know, the several decades of queer film theory and history that has been going on in film studies, and in to a large degree, this book is an attempt to sort of revisit the work of Vito Russo in The Celluloid Closet. This is a groundbreaking study of homosexuality in mostly mainstream Hollywood films that was first published in the early 80s. And, you know, this was the first one to do it, basically, right? This is the first serious film scholar and activist, he was an activist as well, to really dig into the archive and find the thread of queerness in Hollywood throughout its history, from the earliest days of cinema through to the then present day of the early 1980s. And it was a really groundbreaking publication. However, you know, as you might imagine, in many ways this is also quite dated, right? Russo was working in a very particular time and place and moment in queer history and in American history. He was entrenched in the, you know, in the gay community of his time. He was hyper aware of the AIDS epidemic. He himself was HIV positive, and in fact he died of AIDS in the late 80s. He passed away untimely, as many of his generation did, unfortunately, because of the, you know, the terrible epidemic that went ignored by the mainstream for so long, such that it devastated queer communities across the country. And so in a lot of ways, this is, it's very polemical, right? It's very political. You can't talk about queer issues in American media without getting super political and taking a stance. It's just not possible. And, you know, he was looking for a very particular kind of thing, right? He was trying to find, arguably, right, he wanted to open up the possibility of more positive representations of queer people, right, in mainstream American media. Obviously, he did not find that, right? What he found was a history of, erasure, obviously, like, most often, homosexuality is just not talked about at all in American film. And then when queer people do appear, seemingly, they're stereotypical. They fit very neatly into very narrow boxes, and they are either comic relief for us to laugh at, or they're evil villains that need to be destroyed, right? Essentially, right? Those are kind of the two ways in which, the two broad categories that he kind of found in his research. And he does a very good job of tracing that in this book, right? It's a very comprehensive book. He covers like hundreds of movies. And again, this is in the early 80s, like late 70s, early 80s. So this is like before the widespread, there's no digital streaming, there's no DVDs. You might be able to find something on VHS, but usually you had to physically go into the archive and find like the 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter prints of these films and like dig them out. And he did that. He spent years of his life doing that. And this is a groundbreaking work of, really real significance. But it is dated. And, so what Koresky is really kind of trying to do with Sick and Dirty is be in conversation with the celluloid closet, and also to sort of to complicate some of these narratives that we have about like homosexuality, how homosexuality is portrayed in mainstream American cinema. Not to say that like it's good, right? Not to say that it's actually secretly good, but just to sort of complicate it and add a little more nuance back into the conversation, right? Because there's a couple of things that people tend to overlook when they think about portrayals of queerness in sort of mainstream golden age Hollywood cinema, right? Which one of those things is the number of gay people who are actually involved in making the movies, right? There was quite a few, right? There's actors, there's directors, there's screenwriters, people who are significant contributors to the films themselves, who, yes, they were forced to live and work within this strict system of, there's content restrictions, right? Because we had the production code for 30 years or something like that. So you just couldn't, for most of that time, you just could not talk about gay people at all in movies. But these queer people were, as all creatives are in a strict system of censorship, finding ways to work around that in interesting and creative ways. And then there's another aspect of this too, which is the audience. Queer people have always been part of the film-going audience in America. They just have. And many of them really love the films of the classical Hollywood era. We're never going to deny that the system and the society that produced these films was deeply homophobic and continues to be deeply homophobic in many ways. We can never deny that the portrayals of queer people, when they were allowed to exist at all on American screens, were certainly extremely problematic, often stereotypical, and often, by sort of today's standards, just not great, right? But sometimes queerness can escape out from around the edges of things, and even those problematic performances, even those problematic stereotypes can sometimes speak to people, and often do continue to speak to people. So the title of this book, Sick and Dirty, and the photo on the front cover of this book are from the 1962 film adaptation of Lillian Hellman's play The Children's Hour, which, as you can see from this photo, stars Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine as two, they run, these two young women who run a boarding school for girls in New England. The plot of The Children's Hour is pretty simple, but it was pretty incendiary when the play was first written and produced in the early 1930s. These two women are close friends, and one of the students at their school concocts a lie. It is explicitly, we're told it's a lie, it's not like, it's not true, that these two women are in a lesbian relationship with each other. And this lie destroys their lives. It ends up spreading, and then all of the parents pull their kids out of the school. The really important thing, I think, about this play and this film adaptation, is that, you know, there's a key moment at the end in the climax of this play, this film, where the character of Martha, played by Shirley MacLaine in this film, actually confesses that she is actually a lesbian and that she does have feelings for her friend, and then she kills herself. And that is sort of the OG, the example of the self-loathing queer person who then commits suicide, right? That is like a type that we see over and over again. And obviously this is, you know, this is deeply problematic. And the Children's Hour as a film has largely been dismissed by queer critics and not non-queer critics as well, as being, you know, even in 1962 when it was first released, it was kind of dated, and but it was interesting because it was the first film dealing with homosexuality in any kind of explicit way that was released by a mainstream Hollywood studio in the wake of the production code actually being amended to allow for homosexuality to be portrayed in film, in American film. This was done in like 1961. They actually wrote an amendment to the production code. It's the first and I think only time the production code was actually amended since it had been instated in 1930 to actually allow for discussion of or portrayals of homosexuality in American films. Of course, it has to be, you know, like tasteful or whatever. They, you know, they use some vague language about, you know, you got to make sure you're not just being prurient about it. But so in some sense, this was kind of a groundbreaking film because it was the first American film that was able to deal in any kind of explicit way under the production code with homosexual themes. But what Koresky does in this book is that he uses this film. This film, The Children's Hour, is actually kind of the starting point for this project for him. In his prologue, he talks about, he's actually, among other things, he's a film scholar, but he's also a teacher. He's a professor. He teaches at NYU. And he talks about having screened this film for a class of like undergraduates at NYU in, you know, recently, in like a queer film history class. And he was struck by how much it affected his students, and how like he had several students like come to him after the film and talk to him about how much it affected them. And he said that is really interesting to him because this film is sort of, again, it's sort of traditionally dismissed as just sort of being, you know, again, it's just sort of a negative stereotype, and it's just kind of shoved to the side. Like, we're kind of embarrassed, like, we're kind of vaguely embarrassed about the existence of this movie. But his students, his young undergrad students in the 2020s, are watching this film and watching Shirley MacLaine and saying, I can kind of relate to that in some ways, and I feel for her. And she does give a very effective performance. The speech that she makes at the end of the film is very, Again, it's very subjective as to whether you think it's sort of overwrought or too melodramatic or whatever, too histrionic. But I think personally that Shirley MacLaine did a pretty good job. I've seen this film, and I also am affected by it, honestly. I think it is effective. And so, he was struck by that, and that sort of became the seed of the idea for this whole book. And, of course, this wasn't even the first time that The Children's Hour had been adapted for film. William Wyler directed the 1962 film, but he also directed a film version of this in 1935. Of course, it was not called The Children's Hour, and because it was made under the production code of 1930, they had to scrub all insinuations about homosexuality completely out of it. So it was turned into basically a love triangle, and the film was called These Three when it was released. So he uses the film These Three, the first film of The Children's Hour from 1935, and The Children's Hour from 1962, both directed by William Wyler, both based on the same source material, and he uses these as the bookends for this project of discussing queer representations and sometimes non-representations in American film, basically under the production code, right? So from 1935 to 1962, when the production code was amended to allow for homosexuality to be dealt with explicitly in American film. So he uses several, I would say, case studies of specific movies. So he doesn't talk about as many movies as a book like Celluloid Closet does, where it's basically like, this is like a survey of like all movies that have any kind of what you might think of as queer representation in it. It's a pretty broad definition of queer representation, but there's a lot of movies talked about in this book. This book doesn't talk about nearly as many. He sort of hones in on a handful of specific, what he considers sort of interesting case studies. For instance, Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, which is based on, which is about a pair of, again, it's not ever explicitly stated, but it's kind of obvious from context clues that these two men are gay lovers who commit a murder, right? And that film, he also talks about things like Suddenly Last Summer, which was a Tennessee Williams adaptation, which has sort of the specter of a gay man sort of hanging over it. The character is dead at the start of the film, but it's about him, and it's about like what happened to him and how he ended up dead. So stuff like that, right? That's the kind of thing that he talks about in this book. He does also devote a short chapter to Judy Garland and her enduring legacy in the gay community, which is a little bit lighter because a lot of the films that he talks about in here deal with some pretty heavy stuff. But yeah, so in so doing, he kind of traces the evolution of queer representation, and also talks about some of the ways in which queerness kind of bursts from the seams of some of these films in interesting and nuanced ways, right? So, I really like this bit. This is actually from the epilogue of his book. And this is sort of him talking a little bit about the Celluloid Closet and the differences between like what we were doing in the early 80s and what we're kind of doing now. He says Russo was desperate for images of positivity. As a result, many of the films in this book have been tagged in subsequent decades as malicious, sick and dirty, not in the way Martha Doby or Joseph Breen meant, but as diseased emissions from a society plagued by the sickness of homophobia and responsible for instilling the kind of shame that kept generations in the closet. Today, our needs are more complicated. After decades of post-Celluloid Closet course correction with proper pride-stamped entertainments available on every streaming service, even our gayest entertainments can feel hopelessly sanitized, and our cravings for perfect representation are subsiding. We prefer our entertainments to offer a full spectrum of humanistic images, which include queer people in all our psychological complexity: the positive, the negative, the loving, the cruel, the fraught, the kind and the demonic, the standard and the unrecognizable, the normal and the unusual. It's a naughty moment, but we should be thrilled to be able to even wrestle with these ideas out in the open. So again, that's sort of what he's doing here, right? We're not completely abandoning the idea of wanting sort of positive representation, quote unquote, positive representations of gay people in film, right? But we are sort of reassessing some of these older problematic portrayals and trying to think about them in a new way. I'm sorry this was so long-winded, but I felt like I wanted to contextualize this a lot, because it does need contextualization, I think. So yeah, that is this book. I really liked it. Like, not to like take so long to get to the point, but I did really enjoy it. I think Koresky's a good writer and a good scholar. He's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. And I appreciate, especially when it comes to queer scholars of film, he positions himself, right? Because he is part of this, right? He is a movie-going person, and he really likes a lot of these movies that he talks about. Not all of them necessarily, but he does really like a lot of them. And he's okay with admitting that and positioning himself as, a subject in this book at times. And I think that works really well too, because again, as sort of a queer person myself who also really loves classic Hollywood cinema, you can sit there and understand how problematic it is while still also enjoying it and finding pleasure in it. And that is always complicated. It's always messy. There's a lot of nuance to it, but it's worth investigating. It's worth interrogating. And I think he does a really good job of that in this book. So if you're interested in this subject matter at all, I definitely recommend this. Also, it is very accessible. It's a very readable, accessible book. You don't need to be really embedded in film scholarship and queer theory to understand this book. And he does have extensive bibliography and further reading, as well as lists of the films that he cites at the back of the book. So if you're, if you read this and you're like, oh God, yeah, I want to know more, he's got a lot in here that you can dig through. So yeah, that's what I got. That's Sick and Dirty by Michael Koresky. I thought it was a very worthwhile book. I enjoyed my time with it, and it's made me want to rewatch the films I've already seen and watch some of the films in it that I haven't seen before that he discusses, because some of them, sound really interesting. So that's what I got for you this week. Let me know in the comments below what you think of some of these movies. If you've seen The Children's Hour, let's talk about it. It's been a while since I've watched it, but I remember enjoying it, honestly, despite the, again, sort of incredibly dark and some would say sort of, again, it's like the tragic gay stereotype or whatever that's in it. But yeah, let's talk about it. Leave a like if you like this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.